The frost did not just creep into the cabin that winter. It froze a man's toes black while he slept 3 feet from a roaring fire. That was the grim memory that haunted Peter Vane every time he looked at the cold stone hearth of his family's homestead in the Bitterroot Valley. It was November of 1883, and the first snow of the season had already swept down from the northern peaks, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the timber walls. The previous winter of 1882 had been a tragedy that Peter would never forget. He could still hear the agonizing groans of his father, a proud rancher who had spent his life battling the elements, only to be defeated by a drafty, poorly built cabin. His father's foot had turned a terrible, bruised black from frostbite after a night when the temperature in their bedroom dropped below freezing, despite the massive fireplace burning in the main room. The subsequent lung fever, fueled by the cold air and the heavy, soot-laden smoke that the drafty chimney constantly pushed back into the house, had claimed his life before the spring thaw ever arrived. Peter, only 22 years old, was the youngest of the brothers, and the family had always regarded him with a mixture of affection and mild disdain. While his older brother Arthur had inherited their father's physical bulk and traditional ranching instincts, Peter was quiet, thin, and prone to spending his evenings huddled over books. Arthur called him the family dreamer, a young man who wasted precious oil, reading engineering journals his mother had ordered from the East, instead of learning how to build a proper fence or handle a calving season. But Peter's reading was not a waste of time. It was a desperate quest for answers. He had watched his father die because of an architectural failure, and he was determined that his own cabin would not become another cold trap. The traditional frontier cabin, with its single-wall log construction and drafty, exterior stone fireplace, seemed like madness to him. It was a structure designed to bleed heat, forcing families to burn through mountain after mountain of firewood just to keep their water buckets from freezing solid inside their kitchens. As the wind howled outside, Peter stood in his small, newly framed cabin on the eastern edge of the valley, feeling the chill draft, finding every tiny seam between the spruce logs. The ghost of his father's painful end seemed to hover in the cold corners of the room. Arthur had already moved into the main ranch house, leaving Peter with this small plot of land and a warning that he would not survive the winter if he did not start stacking his woodpile high. But Peter knew that simply cutting more wood was a losing battle. He needed to change the very nature of how the house held on to warmth. He looked down at his sketches, his heart beating with a quiet, stubborn resolve. He would build something different, something that would honor his father's memory by conquering the cold once and for all. Peter's cabin was silent, except for the scratch of his graphite pencil against rough butcher paper. By the dim light of a single kerosene lamp, he studied the translated European and Finnish engineering manuals he had spent his meager savings to acquire. These books did not talk about log cabin traditions. They spoke of thermodynamics, specific heat capacity, and fluid dynamics. He was particularly fascinated by the designs of Russian masonry heaters, the Times Pechka Times, and Finnish Times Kakluuni Times stoves. These structures did not rely on the rapid, wasteful combustion of standard fireplaces. Instead, they used a concept called thermal mass. The idea was simple but profound. If you built a heating source with an immense amount of dense material, like stone or brick, and placed it in the exact center of a building, it would act like a thermal battery. A short, extremely hot fire would heat the dense core, and that core would slowly and evenly radiate that stored warmth into the surrounding rooms for hours, even after the fire had died completely. Peter spent 3 months calculating the exact requirements for his design. He learned that the river sandstone found in Sleepy Child Creek had a specific heat capacity of 0.18 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. He calculated that if he could amass nearly 10 tons of this stone and build a core that extended through the center of the cabin up into the sleeping loft, the mass would be capable of holding enough thermal energy to heat the entire cabin through the coldest nights. He drew and discarded 17 different blueprints. The challenge was not just the mass, but the movement of the air. Traditional chimneys let the hot gases escape straight out into the sky, wasting 80% of the wood's energy. Peter's blueprint featured a labyrinth of internal channels baffles built inside the stone core. The smoke and hot gases would be forced to travel in a winding, horizontal and vertical spiral, moving a total of 34 feet before finally exiting the roof. This long journey would force the hot air to transfer almost all its warmth to the sandstone core. When Peter showed the completed diagrams to his mother, she looked at the complex lines of measurements with quiet worry, but she did not dismiss him. She knew the pain that drove him. But Peter's older brother, Arthur, was far less understanding when he caught a glimpse of the drawings. Arthur laughed, calling the elaborate baffles and central placement a useless pile of rock that would only fill the cabin with smoke. He told Peter that no amount of book learning could replace a solid, deep-set fireplace built into an outer wall where it belonged. But Peter folded his diagrams carefully and tucked them back into his coat pocket. He did not need his brother's approval. He had the laws of physics on his side, and he was ready to begin. The bell above the door of Silas Thorne's general store and lumber yard chimed with a sharp metallic ring as Peter Vane stepped inside. The air in the store was thick with the scent of leather harness, kerosene, and the sweet, earthy smell of dry grain. A group of local ranchers and builders had gathered around the cast-iron stove in the center of the room, their boots caked with the dark, sticky mud of the late October valleys. Silas Thorne, a broad-shouldered man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger as Peter approached the counter. Peter did not hesitate. He laid his order down on the worn wooden counter and asked for 9.5 tons of Sleepy Child Creek sandstone, specifying that the blocks must be dense, intact, and delivered to his homestead by the end of the week. The store went completely silent. The soft murmur of conversation around the stove died instantly. Silas Thorne stared at the paper, then looked at Peter over his spectacles. He asked Peter if he was planning to build a fortress, or if he had simply made a mistake in his calculations. 9.5 tons of sandstone was more than double what any standard cabin foundation in the valley required. Before Peter could answer, Caleb Vance, a veteran builder who had constructed 22 log cabins in the Bitterroot Valley, set down his coffee cup with a heavy thud. Caleb was a man whose hands were calloused from decades of handling axes and broadbeams, and his opinion on building was considered law in the settlement. He looked at Peter with a mixture of amusement and pity, asking the young man if he was planning to build a tomb to freeze in. He told the gathered men that stone was a natural conductor of cold, and that wrapping a cabin's interior around a massive pile of wet river rock was the quickest way to turn a home into an icebox. The men around the stove broke into general laughter, nodding in agreement with Caleb's assessment. Jonas Keller, a German-born builder whose family had constructed solid timber homes in the area for 2 generations, joined in. Jonas explained that fireplaces belonged on exterior walls, where the draft could be controlled and the smoke could vent safely outside. He told Peter that a central stone column would only pull heat away from the living space and fill the cabin with soot, leaving him freezing before Christmas. Peter felt the heat rising in his face, but he kept his voice steady. He pulled his folded diagram from his coat pocket and tried to explain the concept of a thermal reservoir, how the massive sandstone core would absorb the heat from a highly concentrated fire and radiate it slowly back into the Dodecan room. But to these men, his explanations sounded like arrogant, impractical nonsense. Caleb Vance shook his head, telling Peter that books might work back east, where the winters were soft, but out here in Montana, the mountains did not care about theories. He warned Peter that his silly project would leave him cold, empty of firewood, and humbled before the winter was through. Peter quietly paid Silas Thorne for the stone, gathered his receipt, and walked out into the crisp autumn air, the laughter of the builders still ringing in his ears. The ride back to the Vane family ranch was long and cold, the heavy gray clouds hanging low over the pine-covered ridges. Peter found his older brother Arthur in the main corral, working to secure the heavy timber gates before the ground froze completely. The horses stood restless in the chill air, their breath rising in thick, white plumes. Peter approached his brother and asked for the ranch's heavy wagon and the team of draft horses for the next 2 weeks. He explained that he needed to haul the 9.5 tons of river sandstone he had purchased from Silas Thorne's yard. Arthur stopped his work, his face tightening with immediate anger. He slammed his heavy hammer down on the fence rail and looked at Peter with deep resentment. He asked Peter how he could have the audacity to ask for the ranch's finest team of horses for a project that everyone in the valley was already calling a joke. Arthur told him that the ranch could not spare the horses or the wagon with the winter preparations still unfinished, and he accused Peter of wasting their father's hard-earned inheritance on book learning and impractical fantasies. The confrontation quickly turned personal. Arthur accused Peter of being a burden to the family, a dreamer who had avoided the hard physical labor of the ranch while their father was alive, and who was now neglecting his responsibilities to build a useless column of rock. He told Peter that their father would have been ashamed of his refusal to build a sensible, traditional log cabin. The words cut Peter deeply, but he did not shout back. He saw the genuine, cold anger in his brother's eyes and realized that he would get no help from his family. Undeterred, Peter returned to his homestead and constructed a crude, heavy wooden sled from green pine logs. If his brother would not lend him the horses, he would haul the stone himself. For the next 2 weeks, Peter spent every daylight hour in the freezing waters of Sleepy Child Creek, selecting the densest, most solid sandstone blocks he could find. He loaded them onto his hand sled and pulled them up the steep, muddy trail to his cabin site, using nothing but his own physical strength. The labor was brutal. The icy water of the creek numbed his feet. His hands became cracked and bloodied from the rough stone, and his muscles ached with an exhaustion he had never known. From the ridge above, Arthur would occasionally ride past on his horse, looking down at his younger brother struggling in the mud, but he never offered to help. He simply watched with a cold, disapproving silence. But Peter did not stop. With every stone he dragged up the hill, his resolve grew stronger. He was not just hauling rock, he was building his family's survival, and he would not let his brother's doubts stop him. By the first week of November, the piles of sandstone blocks sat stacked around the foundation of Peter's cabin like a small quarry. The ground had already frozen hard, but Peter set to work with a spade and a pickaxe, excavating a deep, 4-foot pit directly in the center of the cabin's floor frame. This was the foundation for his thermal core. It had to be dug down to solid bedrock to support the immense weight of the sandstone structure, a requirement Caleb Vance and the other traditional builders had ignored in their own shallow designs. Once the bedrock was cleared, Peter began mixing his mortar. He did not use standard lime mortar, which would dry brittle and crack under the extreme heat of his planned fireplace. Instead, he prepared a flexible, heat-resistant mixture using local yellow clay and fine river sand. This would allow the entire stone column to expand and contract slightly as it heated and cooled, preventing structural failure over years of use. The construction of the inner core was a highly orderly, step-by-step process. In the center, he framed a small firebox, measuring only 6 square feet, less than half the size of Caleb Vance's massive, drafty fireplaces. Peter knew that a smaller firebox would concentrate the fire, raising the combustion temperature to nearly 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. This intense heat would ensure that the wood burned completely, leaving almost no soot or creosote and transferring maximum energy to the stone. Around this firebox, Peter began building the internal baffles. He laid the sandstone blocks in a precise, interlocking pattern, creating a winding maze of vertical and horizontal channels. The smoke from the fire would not rise straight up and out. Instead, it was forced to travel upward into a primary chamber, then descend through secondary channels on either side, before finally rising again through a third channel that led to the roof chimney. This long, 34-foot path meant the hot gases spent maximum time in contact with the stone, transferring almost all their thermal energy to the sandstone core. As the stone column rose, Peter's brother Arthur stopped by to inspect the progress. He stood in the doorway, looking at the massive, 7-foot sandstone tower that now dominated the center of the small cabin. Arthur shook his head, calling the internal baffles a smoke trap that would only back up and choke Peter out of his own home. He told Peter that his complicated design was a disaster waiting to happen. But Peter did not argue. He knew his calculations were sound. He had designed the draft requirements using principles of fluid dynamics, and he knew that the high heat of the fire would generate more than enough buoyancy to push the smoke through the labyrinth. He laid the final stones of the chimney connection, sealed the seams with his clay mortar, and prepared for his first test fire, his heart filled with a quiet, confident anticipation. On a quiet afternoon in mid-November, as a light snow began to dust the Bitterroot Valley, Peter Vane was startled by the sound of a horse approaching his cabin. He stepped outside to find Spotted Otter, a respected elder of the local Salish tribe, riding slowly toward his property. Spotted Otter was an old man with deep lines etched into his face, and he had been quietly watching the young rancher's son hauling stone from Sleepy Child Creek for weeks. Spotted Otter dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his grandson riding beside him to act as a translator. The old man did not speak at first. He walked into the cabin, his dark eyes scanning the massive sandstone core that stood in the center of the room. He ran his hand over the rough sandstone blocks, feeling the clay mortar Peter had mixed with such care. Spotted Otter spoke to his grandson, his voice low and melodic. The grandson translated, telling Peter that his stone fireplace was very similar to the traditional ways of his people. He explained that long before the white settlers arrived with their log cabins and drafty fireplaces, the Salish had built semi-subterranean pit houses for the winter. These lodges were dug deep into the earth and insulated with soil, and they used heated river stones, placed in strategic locations, to hold and radiate warmth throughout the night. The elder explained that his people had always understood the power of the earth and the stone to preserve life. He told Peter that the white man's cabins were built to fight the winter wind, using massive, roaring fires that consumed whole forests, while the family still shivered in the drafty corners. But Peter's design, he said, was wise because it humbled itself to the stone, letting the heat store quietly where it could protect the family without waste. This unexpected validation was a powerful, emotional moment for Peter. For weeks, he had faced nothing but the laughter of the town and the cold resentment of his older brother. To have his design validated by an elder whose people had survived these mountains for centuries gave him a deep sense of peace and reassurance. He realized that his engineering calculations were not a foolish fantasy. They were a rediscovery of a natural truth that humanity had known for generations. Peter spent the next 2 hours talking with Spotted Otter, learning how the Salish managed air circulation in their lodges to prevent smoke buildup while retaining heat. He took notes on their methods of earth sheltering and thermal insulation, realizing that these traditional practices held valuable lessons for his own future building projects. When Spotted Otter finally rode away, Peter felt a renewed confidence in his work. He went back inside, looked at his massive stone core, and felt ready to face whatever winter had to offer. The polar vortex arrived on the morning of the 9th of January 1892, with a suddenness that caught the Bitterroot Valley completely off guard. A massive, slow-moving air mass from northern Canada dropped temperatures across the territory to 32 degrees below zero within hours. The wind howled down from the peaks at 40 miles per hour, turning the air into a frozen, white fog of horizontal ice. Sensory details of the extreme cold were everywhere. The sap inside the pine trees froze and expanded so rapidly that the forest echoed with loud, sharp pops like rifle shots. The snow on the ground was so dry and compressed by the wind that it squeaked like styrofoam under a man's boots. It was the kind of cold that gelled grease in minutes and made breathing a painful chore, freezing the moisture in a person's lungs with every breath. Across the valley, families were in a desperate struggle to survive. In Caleb Vance's traditionally constructed log cabin, the cold was relentless. His fireplace on the exterior wall was drawing in freezing draft from every seam in the log walls, dropping the floor-level temperature to a miserable 36 degrees. His family huddled under layers of wet blankets near the hearth, their water buckets frozen solid inside their kitchen, their breath rising in thick white clouds. Caleb Vance was burning through his seasoned pine logs at a rate that terrified him, knowing his woodpile wouldn't last through the month. The crisis struck Peter's brother Arthur even harder. Arthur had built his ranch house with a conventional, high-draft chimney. Under the intense stress of the sub-zero cold, Arthur had fired his stove to its absolute limit to keep his family warm. But the sudden extreme thermal shock cracked his chimney flue, forcing him to extinguish the fire immediately to prevent the whole house from burning down. Arthur's home filled with thick, bitter smoke and freezing draft within minutes. Without heat, the interior temperature of his house plummeted toward zero. Arthur's wife and children were huddled in the kitchen, their hands numbed, their bodies shivering violently. Arthur looked out the frosted window toward the eastern ridge where Peter's cabin sat, his heart filled with a mixture of terror and desperation. He knew they couldn't survive the night in this freezing, smoke-filled house. He had no choice but to face his pride, pull his family into the wagon, and make the dangerous trek through the blizzard to his younger brother's door, hoping Peter was still alive to help them. Inside Peter Vane's cabin, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was silent, draft-free, and incredibly warm. While the storm raged outside, rattling the outer log walls, the interior temperature of the cabin held steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Peter had only burned a brief, 90-minute fire at dawn, using just 6 split pine logs. Once the fire had burned out, he had sealed the firebox door and the flue damper, trapping the heat inside. The physics of his design were performing beautifully. The 9,500-pound sandstone core, fully charged from the intense heat of the fire, was slowly and evenly radiating its stored warmth into every corner of the room. There were no drafty air currents, no cold zones, no frozen corners. The sleeping loft, situated directly above the sandstone core, was a comfortable 70 degrees, heated by the rising warmth of the stone column. The difference between Peter's cabin and his neighbors' homes was exactly 32 degrees. While Caleb Vance's family was shivering in a cabin that had dropped to 36 degrees inside, Peter sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading his father's old Bible by the warm sandstone core. The physical comfort of the room was a powerful contrast to the freezing misery of the rest of the valley. For Peter, this was a moment of deep emotional healing. He placed his hand on the warm sandstone, feeling the steady, gentle radiation of the heat, and felt a profound sense of justice. He thought of his father's painful death the previous winter, of his father's blackened, frostbitten toes and his coughing, smoke-filled lungs. He knew with absolute certainty that his father would still be alive if they had built this thermal core years ago. The silly dreamer had been vindicated. His calculations, his grueling manual labor, and his refusal to yield to his brother's doubt had saved his own life and created a sanctuary of warmth in the middle of a historic blizzard. He looked out the window, watching the horizontal sheets of snow screaming past his cabin, and felt a quiet, humble pride. He was warm, he was safe, and his father's memory had been honored by the very stone his brother had called a useless pile of rock. The heavy wooden door of Peter's cabin rattled violently as Arthur Vane struggled to open it against the pressure of the blizzard. Arthur stumbled inside, his face pale with cold, his beard coated in thick ice, his wife and children huddled behind him under freezing blankets. He was shivering violently, his breath rising in rapid, terrified gasps. Arthur expected to find his brother huddled near a smoky, failing fire, perhaps freezing like the rest of them. Instead, as he stepped through the airlock, a wave of deep, silent, 68-degree warmth hit his face like a physical barrier. He stood stunned in the doorway, his eyes scanning the quiet, comfortable interior. Peter did not shout, nor did he offer a single word of triumph or "I told you so." He simply stepped forward, helped his sister-in-law and the children remove their freezing coats, and led them to the massive sandstone core in the center of the room. Arthur collapsed against the warm stone, his body shaking as the gentle, radiant heat began to thaw his frozen limbs. He wept silently, his tears freezing and melting on the warm sandstone blocks. Peter handed his brother a hot cup of black coffee and wrapped a dry wool blanket around his shoulders. He did not ask about the ranch or Arthur's cracked chimney. He simply sat beside his brother on the hearth bench, offering the quiet, unconditional support of family. Arthur looked at Peter through his tears, his pride completely shattered by the contrast between his freezing house and this silent sanctuary. He admitted that he had been a fool, that his own traditional methods had nearly killed his family, and that Peter's silly sandstone tower was the only thing that had saved them. Peter placed his hand on Arthur's shoulder, and the sibling divide that had fractured their family for years began to thaw beside the warm river stone. By the afternoon of the second day, the wind had dropped slightly, though the temperature remained a brutal 29 degrees below zero. Pastor Glenn and Jonas Keller made the journey to Peter's cabin on snowshoes, checking on the brothers after hearing rumors of Arthur's cracked chimney. Caleb Vance, carrying his mercury thermometer, came with them, determined to see the tin tomb for himself. When they entered the cabin, the pastor immediately removed his heavy wool coat, marveling at the solid, uniform warmth of the room. Caleb Vance did not speak. He walked directly to the northern wall of the cabin, the farthest point from the sandstone core, and hung his mercury thermometer. He stood there for 10 minutes, watching the mercury settle. The thermometer read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Caleb Vance looked at his instrument, then walked to the south corner and measured again. 70 degrees. Near the sleeping loft, 71. The variance across the entire cabin was less than 4 degrees. There were no drafty air currents, no cold pockets, no frost on the windows. Caleb Vance walked to the sandstone core and placed his hand on the stone. It was still hot, 72 hours after the initial fire had been extinguished. He looked at his own frostbitten fingers, then at the comfortable, warm Vane family sitting around the stone column, and shook his head slowly. He looked at Peter Vane and said simply, "I was wrong. This is the most efficient heating system I have ever seen." The veteran builder of 22 cabins had been humbled by a 22-year-old dreamer's calculations, and the valley's building traditions were changed forever on that afternoon. As spring arrived and the mountain snows melted, the Bitterroot Valley saw a quiet revolution in construction. Caleb Vance, Jonas Keller, and several other local builders began digging deep foundations to build central masonry cores for the upcoming winter, forever changing how cabins were built across the territory. If you enjoyed this journey of innovation and resilience, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Arthur and Peter Vane fully restored the family ranch together. The sibling divide had been permanently bridged by the warm sandstone core that had saved Arthur's family on that freezing January night. Arthur became Peter's strongest supporter, proudly using the ranch's finest team of draft horses to haul tons of stone for Peter's next thermal mass projects, and telling everyone at Silas Thorne's store that his younger brother was the smartest builder in the territory. The brothers worked side by side, their bond restored through the quiet, enduring legacy of their father's memory. Today, Peter Vane's original cabin still stands in the Bitterroot Valley, incorporated into a modern, beautifully preserved ranch house. The massive sandstone core, hand-hauled and interlocked with such care in 1883, remains functional, still radiating gentle, steady heat when the winter wind screams down from Canada. It stands as a quiet, historic landmark to the rancher's dreamer son, who had the courage to trust natural physics over stubborn convention, proving to generations of builders that sometimes the most foolish ideas are the ones that save lives.